Hey y'all, CODI here with a new video, and in this one I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to my Minecraft Survivor Season 2 Roraima review, where in this one I'm going to be ranking the games played by each player on the season from worst to best, based solely on how they played on this particular season. Now, to be clear, this is not me ranking them as players in the grand scheme of things. How would they do on any given season, or how much faith do I have in them to do on any given season? This is specifically a ranking based on how they played on this season. I do also want to make a note that in my original video, when I did this for Minecraft Survivor Season 1 Sherwood, I did like little tiers at the end. I don't feel like doing that, truthfully, where that's something that maybe I can worry about at some later point in time, but I don't find it necessary. Either way, bunch of links are going to be down there in the description to Elite Chris 35. That's the guy that makes the Minecraft Survivors happen. You should go watch those. I'm going to have a playlist to Minecraft Survivor Season 2 Roraima specifically. I will have a link to the Minecraft Survivor Wiki. Do know there are spoilers for all 10 seasons, be warned. Well, technically 12 seasons because they have the unlisted one, and then they also just did another one that was just a kind of a raw recording one, but either way, my point is there are spoilers on the wiki, be warned. And then the last one is going to be a link to TheMeranianReview, which is the channel that kind of inspired me to do any of these, where he does videos similar to this for actual Survivor and then Big Brother, the traders, that kind of stuff. But that's not my wheelhouse, I'm not doing all that. But I like the content, and I wanted to do it for Minecraft Survivor, so here we are. Either way, to get into the rankings, at number 14, the person I believe played the worst game on the season was actually a debate where genuinely I didn't want to put this person at the bottom, but I could not justify putting them above literally anybody on the cast. So at the bottom here, I have Walker. Again, didn't want to have him at the bottom, especially given the situation surrounding the next player we're going to be talking about. But the difference between that player and Walker is that Walker plays an actively bad game. One where I can't really give him any credit at all. If you do want to give him any credit, it comes from the fact that he's at least competent in challenges. This is shown by him winning the immunity necklace for Piedra's first tribal council in the original reward challenge of the season. But again, his game is awful, where once the Alex quit happens early on in the game, the tribe is split into two sides, with Echo, Nifty, and Caleb on one side, Ben, Shay, and Walker on the other. The issue is that the opposing trio is a lot closer to one another than Walker's group. We see Ben flip at the first opportunity in a position where the final decision seems to have been made by Ben and Echo's final conversation, choosing which way they wanted to vote. I think this is particularly damning for Walker because we see Ben hesitate because he says he doesn't want to vote Shay, and that's what makes this difficult, implying that had it not been needing to be Shay, i.e. having another option like Walker, for example, he wouldn't have hesitated, at least not as much. There's also the confirmation from Nifty that had Walker not won that immunity, he would have gone home in the first round. But obviously, if you've seen the season, you would know that none of this is the reason he's this low. Yes, he loses Ben incredibly early, and that's bad. Yes, he would have gone home at the first tribal had he not won immunity. That's bad, but that does not put him this low. The reason he's at the bottom of the list is the following round, where, by the grace of the Nifty's tunnel vision, Walker is put in the middle of the tribe. Nifty shifts complete focus onto Echo, wanting to boot him from the game, which obviously causes a rift in that alliance, where now the tribe is split into two duos, with Caleb and Nifty on one side and Echo and Ben on the other, which miraculously, due to no work that he himself did, puts Walker in the middle of the tribe. He can do whatever he wants. He has his pick of the litter, the power is completely in his hands. Nifty and Caleb pitch for Echo, whilst Echo and Ben pitch to break up the other duo. All of this leads Walker into a spiral where he talks about being done with the game, and he just wishes that somebody would tell him what to do, but people are telling him different things, so it's complicated, and he has power here. Multiple people are vying for his vote. Instead of choosing one side or the other, he chooses to vote himself, which caused Ben and Echo to flip their votes as well to send Walker out of the game. Again, I did not want to put Walker here. He seems like a genuinely nice guy, one who is probably too kind-hearted to the game in all honesty. The issue here is that Walker clearly did not make a game move. He made a personal move, and I get that, and you know that's difficult to wrestle with here, but I'm ranking them based on their games, and as a game, it's horrible. And that's enough for it to land here at number 14. Now number 13, and I cannot believe that this player is not at the bottom of the list. At number 13, I have Alex. Who is Alex? So really, the question for me to wrestle with him is, what do I even do with him? On one hand, he's never voted out and genuinely does not make any mistakes in the game, where we know he was at least in good with Nifty. That's something. And given how the tribe went down, I assume he would have coasted at least for the first two votes, but that does not happen. He just quits the game completely unprompted, where I would then think back to, okay, Sherwood, I assessed both Mason and Angie fairly high, even though they quit. The difference is that even though Mason quit, he still did play the game and have a level of influence on the tribe, and Angie even more so. Alex does quite literally nothing outside of winning reward alongside Nifty in the original challenge. Like, there's nothing. There is nothing to say about him. I do still quarrel with whether or not to have him above Walker, but I do think that Walker's game is just so actively bad that I didn't want to put him any higher than the very bottom spot. So I think that Walker's mistakes outweigh Alex's general nothingness on the season. And straight up, I think that if this was a more just general player ranking, just based on like how I would expect them to do, I think that there is an argument for Alex to be higher because, again, he doesn't make any mistakes, but also he's nothing. He does nothing. I cannot really rank his game. Onwards to number 12, I feel weird about this spot where this player feels like they should be higher on a more general player ranking. They probably would be higher, but regardless, here I have Shay. Again, this does feel low for Shay, but really, I think it's a testament to how okay the cast is in most aspects, where, don't get me wrong, we're still in the bottom spots of the list, but I do think that the debate between Shay and the next player was actually pretty close for me, all things considered. Obviously, on the Piedra tribe, we had the Alex quit. Not really sure how this affects Shay's game, to be completely honest, with the only thing that we do know about Alex being the fact that Nifty intended on working with him to some extent. Either way, though, by the time Piedra loses immunity, I do actually have a knock against her game. And realistically, that's kind of what puts her below the next person, where her and Echo talk, with Echo suggesting that they should bring Ben into the conversation, to which Shay agrees, but says that Echo should talk to Ben alone. And I genuinely do think that had she not done this, she probably does stay, or at the very least, she drastically increases her odds of staying. Where really, Echo and Ben are the core of the tribe at this point, so her giving them more power by leaving herself out of that conversation is pretty asinine, and truth be told, like I'd said, it's the deciding factor for me between her and the next player. She has a good relationship with Walker and a working relationship with both Ben and Echo as well, but it gets flipped on by the both of them. The thing I do give her credit for, though, is that similarly to the next player, I think that Shay is actually kind of screwed out of the game. In her case, it's because Walker won immunity. I also think Shay actually had more potential than the next player as well, where had Walker not had immunity, he for sure goes that first Piedra Tribal. Afterwards, Nifty likely has the same epiphany he does in the season we watch play out, which would then put Shay in the Walker position, coming into the following round, where she would then choose to side with either Ben and Echo or Nifty and Caleb, effectively putting her at the center of the tribe. Now granted, I think in this scenario she just easily sides with Ben and Echo, especially considering the fact that in this scenario Caleb and Nifty would have just voted for her, but I digress. Either way, I do still think that she would have ended up being on the bottom of that trio of Echo, Ben, and Shay, but either way, like, it's a decent spot for her to be in. And again, I think that her having that ability to kind of attach herself to that trio does give her more potential than the next player. However, I do think that the mistake that Shay made by not involving herself in that final conversation with Ben and Echo was a greater mistake than the next player made. Moving on to number 11, I have the first boot of the season, Thomas. I will say through this latest rewatch, my opinion on Thomas's game actually did go down slightly, where before I looked at him as definitively one of the best first boots across the series, and that's still probably the case, but I do think I take more issue with his game now, where he kind of fumbles his way through in the beginning, where All Ranks notes that he doesn't seem to even know how to play Minecraft, noting that it took him longer to put on his buff than everybody else. He messes up in the challenge, he takes longer to sit at Tribal, where all of this just adds to this perception of Thomas being a clumsy player. He does make pretty strong bonds with both Vision and Jervy, and that's something that I credit him with more so than the previous person that we had talked about, which really made these two difficult to rank, but I digress either way. The thing that stuck out to me on this rewatch was the tie of it all, where before, when I was assessing Thomas based on how he'd played on this season, I gave him a lot of credit. I mean, he had half of the tribe on his side. I thought it was impressive that it was a tie vote. The problem is that that's not really the case. Jakal, the person who threw a hinky vote on Vision, was always against Thomas and his side. All Ranks and Chris, as well as Jerry and Jakal, were already working together. As a result, rather than seeing this vote as a 3-3-1 like it was, I more so see it as a 4-3 vote, demonstrated by the revote, but also it was always going to go that way. I think the thing that really made me debate him and Shay, though, is that you can argue Thomas being screwed here as well. Jervy, who, to be clear, I don't think was going home regardless here, won that individual immunity in the initial reward challenge. His other ally, Vision, found an idol and told the entire tribe about it at Tribal, shifting the vote off of him and onto Thomas. I think there is definitely a debate, though, between him and Shay, where, for me, they do both get kind of screwed out of the game due to others in their alliance having immunity in a position where those people would have gone over them in a more natural Tribal. And honestly, I originally had Thomas above Shay. Changed my mind to have Shay above Thomas, and then after considering it, which by considering it I mean writing through this script, I think that Shay has more potential had she stayed. But again, like I said before in her entry, I think that the mistake of her not having that final conversation is a bigger mistake than anything that Thomas does. Where genuinely the worst thing that Thomas does in the context of the game is align with Vision and Jervy, the two people who had some sort of immunity. But I don't see that as being as bad as what Shay did. Despite this, on a more general player ranking, I think I would have Shay above him. I think that, again, Shay had more potential on this season. I think that she has more potential on most seasons. All in all, Thomas is still a first boot at the end of the day, but I did genuinely consider bumping him up a spot or two on the list, but I think that would be kind of crazy. Moving on to number 10, and I will say I actually dropped this player a spot over the course of this scripting process. I have the first juror of the season, Jervy. I think that this is another similar spot to Shay, in which I think that Jervy is likely a better player than this spot on the list shows, but as for the game he played, I think it's actually pretty bad, and genuinely I think that there is a solid argument that he should be below Shay and Thomas, where the biggest knock against Jervy's game is that while he does make it to the final 10, he also does get booted at the first possible opportunity, where he's immune during the Thomas boot round, and doesn't go to tribal again until the swap, and at that point he is swiftly taken out in a position where Arcia had the majority. He starts the game forming a decent bond with the likes of Vision and Thomas, two very reliable allies. He wins individual immunity in the initial reward challenge, taking it right before all ranks could get it. He's then on the bottom when Thomas goes home, where, as I've said before, the breakdown on the OG Arcia tribe is a pretty clear 4 versus 3, where I will say, to give him some minor credit, he is kind of screwed over by Vision's idol, specifically with Vision telling the entire tribe about it, which is just so stupid. We'll talk about it later. But again, the likes of Jakal, Jerry, All Ranks, and Chris were already intending to vote for Vision. So had Vision just kept quiet about it and then played the idol on himself, there's a chance that they can snipe Jerry out of the game and come into the following round with even numbers. Either way though, obviously that does not happen. He remained on the bottom, where had Arcia lost again, I think the most likely event is the majority just splitting their votes on Jerry and Vision to cause a 2-2-2 vote. I would assume Vision goes at this point in the game. There is definitely a chance that Jerry goes, and again, if they just lose again, then Jerry definitely goes at that point, where All Ranks was pretty vehemently against him from the get-go. He does make it to the swap, where he's with Ben and Echo from Piedra, as well as Jerry and Vision from Arcia, where this is actually a very difficult position for him. He wants to remain Arcia strong, which I do think is probably the right call, but he needs to do that in order to get through the swap. Unluckily for him, both Vision and Jerry really want to target the other, leading to Jervy's hand being forced. He needs to pick a side. He in a position where, again, I think he chooses the right side at that point. Vision is a lot more likely to work with him than Jerry is at that point in the game. The problem is that he fails to recognize that Echo is already solidly against him and Vision as well. With the influence that Echo held over Ben at that point in the game, it led to Ben also being against Jervy. Obviously, there was already some animosity built up from Jerry at that point, given that Jervy and Vision had just tried to burn him at the previous tribal they went to. I do think that people could argue that Jervy is screwed over due to the visitation ticket allowing for Jakal and Nifty to vote at the tribal, but for me, I don't see it that way at all. Where Jervy was going home anyways in a vote of 3-2, this only bumped it up to a 5-2 vote. If anything, I guess he's unlucky to align with Vision in the first place, but again, with that, Echo was the ultimate decider this round and actively chose to send Jervy home over Vision. All in all, talking through it, I kind of want to put him lower, but I do think that ultimately he did have potential in the game. I do think he had a correct head on his shoulders, and I don't think that the choices he makes are inherently wrong all the time. I just think that the game he played on this particular season ended up really being the worst case scenario for him. And now we have made it to the section of the list of players who have survived at least one tribal without immunity, as well as not quitting. Truly the upper echelon of Minecraft Survivor Roraima. And here we are starting all of that with a player who did not only not quit, but wasn't even voted out. We'll talk about it. At number 9, we have Vision, who is a player who is so hard for me to rank. Where, to be completely genuine, I think that there is a actual argument to have him as low as number 12 on this list, only above Walker and Alex. However, when I was thinking it through, I mean, like, everybody that's below him doesn't survive a single vote without immunity. Vision survives multiple votes without immunity. Now, granted, he was the primary primary target slated to go home at the very first tribal, and then actively blows up his spot even more by revealing his idol to the tribe. But whatever, he survives, guys. Vision's game is genuinely about as awful as it possibly could be for somebody who made it to the final tribal council. He's immediately on the bottom of Arcia, poised to go home if he doesn't play the idol on himself. Even then, he saps all of that power from his own idol actively, and then actively chooses to make his idol public at the first tribal. Squeaks by to the swap in a spot where he did nothing to help his case, is saved by the likes of Echo in a spot where Echo isn't saving him because he likes Vision. He actively talks about disliking Jervy and Vision, but obviously Jervy is just much more of a threat, so much so that Echo imposes his will on Jerry, who, mind you, wanted Vision to go home, but even then, I don't give Vision credit. He's still targeting Jerry in a spot where it makes no sense for him to keep targeting Jerry here. And then also, there's the fact that if they did not swap and they were still on Arcia, Vision just goes home next. He's just still on the bottom, where, like I said with the Jervy thing, I think that the majority splits their votes between Vision and Jervy, and I do think they send Vision home. But either way, back to the Jerry thing. The bond between him and Jerry is already severed. I get that. But Vision's unwillingness to even attempt to work with him is lucrative, considering the fact that he's the one who burned that bridge in the first place. Where at least Jervy was trying to stay RCS strong. He fails, but at least he tried. And then Vision gets to the merge where he is still on the bottom. He's out of the loop for the first 2 rounds of the merge. He does successfully get Nifty out in a spot where he's possibly the least integral number in getting that vote through. And then from then on, he's just being dragged to the end because everybody in the game knows that they can beat Vision. Where Jerry and Ben are obviously dragging him to the end and knowing that that's quite possibly their only winning scenario. And then you also have the trio of Allrings, Chris, and Caleb, who are also dragging Vision to Final Four as someone that will be very easy to beat in the end. Once Jerry wins immunity, that trio is actively targeting Ben because of how little of a threat Vision is. They are targeting Ben as the biggest threat available. What? I will give him minor credit for the All-Ranks boot because at least he didn't screw it up. That's something. That's good. I gave him next to no credit, though, for the Chris boot, where he thinks he's in the middle despite him literally not being in the middle. And then we obviously get to his absolutely atrocious Final Four round, where this is the second worst round of gameplay for any individual player across the entire season for me. And the only reason that it is not getting the gold for that is because at least he did not vote himself out. I can give him credit for that. Vision did not vote himself out of the game, but he has this ridiculous plan to get everybody else to vote for each other so that he can pull off a 2-to-1-to-1 vote, which is so stupid. It's so stupid, and it completely blows up in his face. Once again, I give him pretty much no credit for the Caleb move. And then he gets to the final tribal in a spot where he cannot win. I don't think there's a single person on the entire cast that he would have been able to beat in a jury vote, where if by some unholy power he was able to get to the end of the game with Alex and Walker, I don't think Vision wins. I think he's genuinely the biggest goat on the board. He actively annoys people and pisses them off. He makes multiple completely unnecessary lies, and to top it all off, he's delusional in the game, where he fully believes that he's a swing vote throughout the game despite literally never once being a swing vote. He has no control when Thomas goes. He has no control when Jervy goes. He's blindsided when Jakal and Echo go out. He's the least integral number of the Nifty boot. You can technically argue that he's a swing vote in the All-Ranks boot, where technically he could have booted Ben, which would have been an astronomically horrible move for him, and the exact same thing plays out at the Final Five, where yes, he could boot Ben, but again, the only minor semblance of a chance that he has at winning this game is if it's a Final Two and he's up against Ben. Now granted, I don't think he wins that anyways. I think that Ben probably slams him unanimously in a jury vote, but still, at least there is a micro chance there. But either way, again, obviously he's not going to vote out Ben. Again, it's the only modicum of a chance, but also his hostile relationship with Chris also probably makes that a little bit harder for him. And then in the Final Four, he tries to force himself to be the swing vote, only for that to again blow up in his face, with him having zero respect from the jury by the time he gets to the final tribal. Genuinely, I think that Vision is one of the worst players of the season, if not the worst, where if the player were simulated 100 times, I don't know if he ever wins. However, like I said before, this list is not based on my faith in these players in the grand scheme of things, just based on their games on this season. And yes, his game is horrendous. It's atrocious. It's a horrible game. But I mean, like, he's a finalist. He does survive a decent amount of tribals, and it felt really weird for me to put this player who got all the way to the end below people that literally went at the first possible opportunity, but I could not put him any higher than this. This was the highest I was willing to put him. I feel like I'm highballing him by putting him this high. But again, he's a finalist. That's enough for him to be at number 9. Moving on to number 8, we have a player who plays an incredibly flawed game still, but is also somehow the first player that has some genuine upside to their game on this list, and that player is Nifty. Where Nifty's biggest flaw in the game is how completely tunnel visioned he gets about booting Echo. I don't think his targeting Echo in the first place is inherently bad in its own right, but his utter refusal to do literally anything other than target him is a problem. But again, I think there's upside, where for at least the first bit of the game, I give him a lot of credit on Piedra, where I do think it's him running the show at the very beginning, having close ties to both Caleb and Echo, and he's also the one player that we know had a relationship with Alex. That's all good. He's also the one who starts to pull Ben over to his side, explaining that it would have been Walker to go had he not won immunity. This first part of the first round is pretty okay. I do think I give Echo more credit than him by the time of the Shea boot, where genuinely I think that this comes down to Echo and Ben's decision. But regardless, Nifty is still in a decent spot until his game crumbles because of Nifty, where he just grows this one-sided vendetta against Echo. And his rationale of this is just that he thinks that Echo's gonna run the game, where he gets Caleb on board, tries and fails to get Walker on board, so much so that Walker would rather vote himself out. But genuinely, I don't fault Nifty too much here, where a lot of the blame for the Walker boot is placed solely on Walker. Either way, Nifty makes it to the swap, where I think he's completely swap screwed, where All Ranks Chris and Jakal are already working together, and they also get along very good with Caleb, which put Nifty squarely on the bottom, where realistically, had the players on Arcia been playing optimally, I think Nifty just straight up goes home. The original Arcia members talk about being worried for Jerry on the opposing tribe. They should be throwing this challenge so that they can save Jerry and just boot Nifty. Granted, that does not happen, but still, Nifty is in danger and is a lot closer to Caleb than Caleb is to him. We see that with Caleb throwing him under the bus. At the merge, Nifty once again tries to target Echo, but is unsuccessful, where I do fault him the most for losing Jakal. I think it's mostly on him. Granted, there's always a chance that Ben and Echo wouldn't have sided with Jakal anyways, but with Nifty standing up at Tribal and doing what he did, that chance of a flip evaporated. Not for nothing, he also does lose standing with Caleb, where Caleb is a part of the alliance that boots Jakal. In the following round, he does finally get Echo out, but I really just don't give him that much credit for the actual Echo boot, where it feels like Caleb just taking advantage of Nifty, knowing that Nifty will always target Echo, and using that as a guaranteed number to drive the vote home. Right afterwards, he's taken out by Caleb after Nifty decided to flip against his number 1 ally, which again, just like the Echo thing from earlier, I don't think the thought is bad. He knows he would lose to Caleb in a jury vote and thus wants to get ahead of that. I understand the move, I get it. The problem is he was trying to make that move too soon when he didn't have that much social capital in the game. All in all, I don't have that much faith in Nifty in the grand scheme of things, but on this list, I think he does have some upside to his game, which is enough to put him here at number 8. Now number 7, and again, I think we're at the point in this list where the games are getting better. I think that this person is really kind of the in-between that separates everybody, where I think that everybody above this player played an actively good game, with everybody below this player playing varying levels of bad games, where this player plays a solid game, and that player is the merge bit of the season, Jakal. I think the hard thing about putting Jakal any higher for me is that he really goes home at the second opportunity, where on the original Arcia tribe, he gets along great with Jerry, the two becoming very close very quickly, and then linking up with the other duo on the tribe, All Ranks and Chris, at which point Jakal coaxes Vision into playing an idol, which I think is good play on his part. He then later lies about siding with Vision on the original vote, which is just so stupid but ultimately harmless. I do give him credit at the Jervy boot, where Nifty actually gives Jakal all the power this round, where because of how the votes shake out, if Jakal wanted to, he could have sniped Jerry out of the game. Now granted, that was never happening, but it was a decision that was made purely by Jakal, and I do credit him with building enough of a bond with Nifty that Nifty would pretty much just let Jakal vote twice, evidenced by the fact that Nifty didn't even vote Echo, which is an accomplishment at this particular point in the game. He then makes it to the merge, which his play isn't great. He's cut loose by the likes of Chris and All Ranks, which is pretty bad. He's ultimately booted despite doing good work though, where towards the end he does try to formulate this last second plan to boot All Ranks. He doesn't doesn't just give up. He tries to pick up Echo and Ben as numbers along with Nifty and Vision, only for Nifty to stand up at Tribal, completely solidifying that Echo will vote against them this round, which I'm not gonna fault Jakal much for Nifty's tunnel vision. All in all, I think Jakal's probably a worse player than his game demonstrates on this season, where he is this just loud, obnoxious, boisterous personality. But either way, based solely on his gameplay on this season, I would not expect for Jakal to be a particularly incredible player. Now, number 6, and like I said, I think we've made it to the players who did play good games on the season. These are all players who do certainly have flaws, but I do think the pros outweigh the cons for every remaining player by an okay amount. But either way, surprisingly to myself, down here at number 6, I have Echo. And straight up, I wavered a lot with these next 3 spots. Ultimately, I do think it makes sense to have Echo this low. Again, I think that this is just simply in a spot where we're at that point in the list. Everybody else has played solid games. Echo is probably the best positioned player on Piedra by the time of the Shea boot, where I do think you could argue between him and Nifty for who was better positioned before Tribal, but I fully believe that it was Echo and Ben's decision on whether or not to boot Shea, and Echo being the more influential player tells me that he probably was the better positioned player between him and Ben. I think that Echo also gets unlucky that Walker wins immunity, where had Walker not won it, he could have just taken him out and had Ben and Shea with him in the following round. I do think I have to discredit him a little bit for the idol play. I get why he does it. A public idol is not a particularly strong one, but also he does pretty much just give up an idol, which is a knock. The following round again, I do knock him, where his move to boot Walker is just so risky. I think ultimately this is more of a Ben thing, where I do think that Ben likely convinced him to boot Walker here, but again, if they were wrong, Echo just goes home here with the votes of Walker, Nifty, and Caleb. I don't fault Echo much at all for Nifty's blind targeting of him, and realistically, I don't fault him too much for Walker's quit either because of how bizarre the circumstances here are. He gets to the swap where he's in a good position again with both Jerry as well as Vision and Jervy, vying for his and Ben's vote. Echo personally sides closer with Jerry, while Ben sides more with Vision and Jervy, but Echo ultimately gets his way. In the merge, once again, he's in the middle, being able to swing to boot either Jakal or all ranks, and ultimately, I think his best play would have been the shift of the target onto Nifty, but it just was not in the cards at that point in the game, where his next best play is probably to snipe all ranks, but obviously, once Nifty does what he does, it's a lot better for Echo to just fall in line and boot Jakal. In the following round, he does start trying to target Chris, where I get why, given that Chris was a pretty big social threat at that point in the game, being somebody who's pretty well insulated. The problem is that he could not keep Caleb in line, where Caleb drives the vote against him. I think there's a good amount of credit to give Echo overall, where I think he's the decider in the Shea boot, the Jervy boot, and the Jakal boot. He also had Ben in his pocket. He also likely steamrolls a jury vote if he gets to the end. However, I don't think anybody on this castle is going to let him get to the end because everybody knew how big of a threat he was. All in all, Echo's game on the season is one where he becomes too big of a threat too soon, but he does run multiple votes across the season, and that is noteworthy enough to put him this high on the list for me. Number 5, I have a player who was really hard for me to rank, where honestly, I didn't really know what to do with this player, and that's Chris. Where Chris plays a really clean game, I think. The problem for me is that I don't really know what he was doing as an individual in the season. He's aligned with all ranks from the get-go, siding to keep Jerry alongside Jakal, doesn't go to another tribal until the merge, but in the swap he is in a good spot, where it's him and all ranks at the top of the tribe, they loop in Caleb, and whilst Chris does start to let go of Jakal, which again, I don't think that's ideal, it doesn't really matter since he just takes Jakal out in the merge, and really I give him the most credit on the tribe for getting the Jakal boot through, and it's because he drives that vote through that I did put him above Echo. If he didn't have something like this on his resume, I probably would have had Echo higher. Either way, he then takes a bit of a backseat while staying in the majority for the Echo and Nifty boots, and after that his game crumbles, where Caleb takes the initiative, flips on all ranks, flips back to work with Chris only for Chris to go home anyways. Genuinely, I think that Chris gets pretty unlucky here. Obviously, Caleb flips on him, that's bad, but if all ranks had won immunity, I don't know if Caleb flips, which would have practically guaranteed Chris making Final 4. Now granted, there's also the chance that Caleb does still flip, and it's just Chris going home, but either way, there's also the fact that had all ranks played his idol at 6, like he should have done, Chris also goes home in that spot. In the following round, he's unlucky again, where had Caleb not won immunity, Caleb likely goes home. If Chris gets to the end, I don't know exactly what his win equity is. He definitely beats Vision, probably beats Ben and Jerry as well, but I'm not 100% sure on that. Though I do think he loses to the likes of all ranks and Caleb in a position where he was actively striving to get to that final 3. Again, I think there's some debate between him and Echo as well as the next player, where with Echo, I think his pre-merge is stronger, and I think Echo has more direct control at more points in the game, but Chris does at least drive a vote, and unlike Echo, I think that Chris did manage his threat level, where for me, I think the trio of All Ranks, Chris, and Caleb really run the season. And Chris was the least threatening of that trio, which is not inherently a bad thing. All in all, his game is clean. I don't think he makes too many active mistakes, but he does get flipped on, and ultimately, I just didn't have the confidence to put him any higher than number 5. Now for number 4, and I think some people might question why this player is so high, but genuinely, I think that on subsequent rewatches, my opinion on this player did go up, and that's the other runner-up of the season, Ben. Like I've said in these past few entries, I did debate the likes of Chris, Echo, and Ben, but ultimately, Ben being at the top is weird to me, because I think he's probably the worst player of these 3, but I do think that his game on the season is arguably the best of the 3, where ultimately, Ben's biggest enemy on the season is Ben, where he is just so unbelievably paranoid to the point that it annoys players like Echo. Either way, on the old Piedra tribe, he does choose to boot Shay. By the way, he talks in confessional. It seems like he didn't really want to do that. However, part of why he did was simply because Walker had immunity, where had that not been the case, he would have been a lot more willing to flip on Walker than Shay. I think that you can argue that he should have tried to force a tie, but I fully get why he doesn't, where Walker has immunity. If he'd voted for Caleb and it deadlocks, then both Shay and Caleb become safe, making it a 1 in 3 chance of Ben going home by random draw. But also, Echo had an idol that he played, so really, by Ben trying to vote, it's a 50-50 shot of either him or Nifty going home. Granted, there was also the option of convincing Echo to also boot Caleb, but we don't see that conversation happen, so we don't really know for sure how that went. Either way, during the Walker boot, I think Ben is actually playing the best on all of Piedra for this round, where I think he does the best job of talking to Walker, and like I said, I think it was likely Ben that convinced Echo to boot Walker in the first place, which again, it's a very risky move, but the wonkiness of the situation makes me give Ben some grace, but also again, like it's just such a bizarre vote round to assess on a gameplay merit list like this. Either way, he doesn't do too much in the swap, but also the little that he does do doesn't make him look the greatest, where he initially sides with the Vision and Jervy, but is then ultimately pulled over by Echo to side over with Jerry. He also does talk to Jakal though, and build a little bit of a bond with Jakal, where Jakal tells him like, hey, you should just try to side with Jerry. So all in all, it's not bad necessarily, but it's not great either. Anyways, thanks to his connection to Echo, he's pulled into the majority at the merge, where he and Echo are in the middle and choose to boot Jakal. He's then blindsided when Echo goes home, which I did talk about a little bit in my review. I don't really fault him too much for being blindsided. Everybody on the tribe knew how close Echo and Ben were, so them leaving Ben out of the loop is entirely natural in my opinion. Now, obviously, fault him for losing Echo at all in the first place, but the fact that he didn't see it coming isn't something I hold against him too much. On the other hand, he gets blindsided at the Nifty boot too, and that's pretty bad. But after that, I think his game is pretty solid, where he is being targeted by the likes of the other side, but he's actually pretty safe once Caleb flips, where I don't give Ben much credit for the all ranks move, but it does benefit him a lot. He's then in the majority when Chris and Caleb go out back to back, and genuinely, I think that Ben getting votes at those last few tribals is actually kind of a good thing for him, where it shows that he's somebody who is being taken seriously in the game, unlike Vision. All in all, Ben's game to me isn't too far off of Chris's, where Chris is the second in command to all ranks, Ben is the second in command to Echo, with the differences being that Chris directly led a vote, whereas despite being the swing at multiple points, Ben mostly relies on Echo. However, unlike Chris, Ben gets to the end, and what puts him above the likes of Chris and Echo for me is that Ben gets votes. I think had it been a spot where Ben is a 0 vote finalist like Vision, I think yeah, I probably would have had him below the likes of Echo and Chris, but Ben comes 1 vote away from winning the game, and had it been a final 2 of Vision and Ben, I think that Ben wins, probably in unanimous fashion, and I think that's something too. He's also a player who, despite losing in his best scenario, actively strove to get to his best case scenario, and I do give him credit for that too. The biggest demerits to Ben's game though is he is a very paranoid player, and again, like I just said, despite getting to his best case scenario of a final 3, he does still ultimately lose. Despite this, I do think his game is pretty solid, and I feel okay having him this high. Now for number 3, and this one's tough because I think for me there was a very clear number 1, but this player and the following were pretty tough for me to decide between, where I think one player has higher highs but also lower lows, while the other player was a more consistent player despite still definitely having their flaws. But at the end of the day, despite how well this person played the game at points, I think that their one boneheaded decision was enough for me to drop them down here, so at number 3 I do have all ranks. I think with all ranks the thing is that he really did this to himself, man. The fact that he doesn't play his idol in his boot round is pretty ridiculous in my mind, where all ranks is such a juicy target, he should have seen it coming, with him even talking in confessional about how dumb they would be to leave him in the game. Granted, it made for incredible TV, but still, All Ranks is such a dominant force in the challenges that I think taking the guarantee would have been fine, since he likely just wins the immunities to get to the end regardless. Either way, to run through the game proper, he starts on Arcia probably being at the top of the tribe, where it's really him and Chris alongside Jakal and Jerry, with All Ranks being the most vocal about wanting Thomas to go. After Thomas goes, All Ranks doesn't go to tribal again until the merge, but again, he was fine on the swap tribe, where I think he finds himself on the top of that tribe alongside Chris. He comes into the merge and sticks with Chris and Caleb, joining with Echo and Ben, create a 5-person alliance. I think I should fault him slightly for being the target of Jakal, but ultimately that doesn't go anywhere, so I think it's fine. At the final 7 and 8, he wins immunity, where he is in the majority, although I do think he's being outplayed by Caleb, where I give Caleb more credit than All Ranks in those 2 rounds. Either way, then we get to the final 6, where again, he's outplayed by Caleb, and Jerry pulls the trigger. That being said, unlike Echo, I think All Ranks really does run a portion of the season up to his boot, where genuinely, I think the most integral players to the season were him, Chris, and Caleb. And in that trio, I think he was closer to both Chris and Caleb than they were to each other. That being said, he's simply too big of a threat. I do think, though, that his game is solid. As a player, he's competent strategically, fine socially, and excels in challenges. As a player in the grand scheme of things, I think he's possibly the best player on the season, based on what we saw in Roraima. However, it is not enough to be higher for me due to how much I fault him for his boot round, where, like I said, I think he's very much so a fault for that round. Moving on to number 2, we have the winner of the season, Jerry. And genuinely, I didn't debate this. Where Jerry was a lot closer to All Ranks than he was to the person above him, despite having won the season. Despite his game being overall rockier than All Ranks, I think All Ranks' poor play in the final 6, in conjunction with Jerry's pretty flawless endgame stretch, was enough for me to feel comfortable landing Jerry higher. Despite being in the majority, Jerry is in danger at the beginning of the game, where had Vision not made his idol public and played it for himself, Jerry does go home. And really, that's the big debate for me between Jerry and All Ranks, is if that idol comes out and it gets played correctly, Jerry goes home. Again, it's in a position where he gets idled out, but still, he goes home. He makes it to the swap where Vision and Jervy are once again targeting him. He wants Vision out, but Echo keeps him in line to boot Jervy, where I don't think that that's a horrible move for him, where obviously Vision ends up being a very integral number for him moving forward, but ultimately he doesn't get the move that he wanted to get done, so that is something to note. He's then out of the loop when Jakal goes, but his game builds up a lot after that, being in the majority for the rest of the game, where he does boot both Echo and Nifty. I think the final 6 round, he does get lucky, where had he not won immunity, and especially if All Ranks did win it, I do think that Jerry is in danger in that spot, but he does pull off the All Ranks move, which I give him and Caleb both a lot of credit for. But genuinely, Jerry's in a better spot after the move is executed than Caleb is, where I think Jerry is in the best spot in the game from that point on. He's the swing vote in the final 5, where he makes the right call in booting Chris, and in the final 4, despite not wanting to do it, he does ultimately pull the trigger on Caleb, knowing that if he doesn't, he'll lose the game, which does show a level of killer instinct. Now, I don't love that he only wins in a 4-3 vote against Ben, and genuinely, I get having All Ranks higher. I'm pretty 50-50 on it. Straight up, the more I'm talking about it, yeah, All Ranks could have definitely been higher. But again, for me, I think Jerry obviously had more longevity. But also, I don't think any of Jerry's rounds individually are worse rounds than All Ranks is in the final 6. Furthermore, I think Jerry has pretty masterful positioning in the end game, where I specifically remember Caleb talking in confessional at one point about how he wasn't going to try to target Jerry anymore because he didn't think he'd be able to get the numbers on him. At the end of the day, it's still not enough for him to be number 1, but I feel pretty okay with putting him at number 2, even if there is definitely an argument for him to be below All Ranks. Either way, moving on, the player I believe played the best game on Minecraft Survivor Season 2 Roraima, the Mesa Outback, is Caleb. And again, as I've alluded to, I don't think that this is close. I think that Caleb is pretty easily number 1 for me. In classic Roraima fashion, I think there is a low point for him towards the beginning of the game, but I think he's pretty damn well positioned for most of the season. On Piedra, he's working with Nifty, successfully survives over Shay, works with Nifty to boot Echo, but is unsuccessful. However, unlike Nifty, he manages his relationship with Echo pretty well moving forward. At the swap, despite not going to tribal, I think he does really great work in worming his way in with All Ranks and Chris, effectively replacing Jakal in that trio, whilst pushing Nifty to the bottom of that tribe had they lost immunity. He comes into the merge, wins immunity in a spot where I don't believe he needed it. Either way, he works with the majority to boot Jakal, which I think is more so Chris's move, but I do also give Caleb some credit. Then we get the Echo boot, which I think Caleb deserves most of the credit for, followed by the Nifty boot, which again, I give a lot of credit to Caleb. Then we get to the All Ranks boot, which once again, I do credit Caleb a lot here. The problem is that the move benefits Jerry more so than Caleb, whereby Caleb taking All Ranks out of the game, he becomes the biggest threat on the board and does go home at 5 and 4 unless he wins immunity. That being the case, I don't know if he beats All Ranks in the end, and also despite him not not knowing about All Ranks' idol, the fact that All Ranks has an idol does make this move more worth making. Either way, in the following round, he does try to work with Jerry, but Jerry obviously sides with Ben and Vision at that point, turning his back on Caleb and Chris, where Caleb gets to the final four in a position where he beats everybody in a landslide if he gets to the end, but ultimately he does lose immunity in a very dramatic fashion, a fraction of a second, and gets booted as a result. Really, I think Caleb is the core of the season. I think he played a more impressive game on this season than anybody did on Sherwood. Yes, his early game on Piedra is bumpy, but the walk around in particular is just such a bizarre round of gameplay to assess. And he also plays the swap masterfully and also plays a really solid merge game up to the All Ranks boot, where again, at that point, he does need to win immunities to get to the end, but he also comes so close to doing that in a position where, again, he beats everybody left at that point. I think his game is really great, and it's pretty easily the best game played on the season for me. And that is all. That's my ranking of every player on Minecraft Survivor Season 2, Roraima, the Mesa Outback. Truthfully, I really like doing these Minecraft Survivor videos, but they also do take a lot out of me. Just from these 2 seasons, my cumulative script count is upwards of 50,000 words, let alone the time it takes to write the scripts. I also have to record them and edit them, which you would think editing is quick given my proclivities towards what essentially amounts to a Google slide presentation, but I promise, dear viewer, I spend hours on end clipping audio. If you're curious and simply must know, the Roraima review had a total of 2,146 clips in the audio. Doesn't that sound fun? Either way, as I approach the 8,000 word mark on this script, I'm ready to be done. Of course, I will be back to cover Season 3, but do expect a bit of a wait for that review as I focus on other stuff. I'm not going to give any sort of release window, but I'd be shocked if it's not at some point this year. With all of that being said, please make sure to go watch the season proper yourself. It's free on YouTube at EliteChris35. Link to his channel and the Roraima playlist in the description. I'll also leave a link to the wiki, which again has spoilers, and finally a link to the TheMeranianReview's channel, who inspired this kind of content. Either way, that's all. So as always, take care, y'all.